It began in silence, the kind that Paris keeps for her secrets. A thin veil of fog drifted along the Seine that morning, muting the world into shades of grey. The first boatman to notice the shape beneath the Pont Neuf thought it was a bundle of rags. Only when the current turned did he see the face, pale, expressionless, as though sleep had simply failed to end. By the time Inspector Moreau arrived from the Quai des Orfèvres, the river had already reclaimed its calm, but the city was whispering again. A man without papers, without history, without anyone to claim him. The kind of death that seems to erase its own reason for existing. Yet Moreau, with the quiet certainty that made others uneasy, knew at once that this was no drowning. It was a message written without words, sent by someone who understood silence better than speech. And in that silence, somewhere between the echo of a train departing Gare de Lyon and the rustle of wet newsprint on the quay, began the duel, invisible, methodical, and deadly. Stories like this one are not told by newspapers. They fade into the murk unless someone listens. If you wish to follow Inspector Moreau through every layer of this mystery, through the rain, the lies, and the quiet confessions that never reach the courts, stay with us. Subscribe, share, or simply keep the lamp burning as we open the first chapter. The dawn crept into Paris with the quiet reluctance of a man waking from a troubled dream. The fog lay low upon the Seine, clinging to its embankments as if trying to hold back the day. From the Pont Neuf, the lamps still burned with their tired yellow glow, halos trembling in the mist. The river below seemed to breathe, black and slow, its surface unbroken but for the soft eddies that caught the reflection of the sky. Then came the shout of a boatman, muffled by distance and fog, the kind of sound that does not startle the city so much as make it stir uneasily in its sleep. Inspector Moreau arrived not long after the first report reached the Quai des Orfèvres. His overcoat carried the smell of damp wool and pipe smoke, and his hat brim was heavy with dew. Two gendarmes stood by the parapet, staring down at the shape the river had yielded. One of them saluted, the other simply stepped aside. The boatman's pole rested against the stone, the hook still dripping. On the planks below they had laid the body of a man. Bareheaded, water-darkened hair clinging to his forehead, the skin of his face as pale as the marble of the morgue. The inspector crouched, his knees creaking quietly. He did not speak for some time. The man's clothes were of good quality, though worn. An overcoat of English cut, a waistcoat whose lining had been mended by hand, no papers, no wallet, no watch. Even the labels had been carefully cut from the fabric. The body carried no name. Only the faint bruise around the neck, a half ring, as though a cord had pressed there long before the river claimed him. "Suicide," murmured Janvier, who had followed behind, rubbing his hands together against the cold. Moreau said nothing. His eyes moved to the hands, rough palms, nails short, one knuckle scarred as if from an old fight. He touched the man's coat sleeve, then the inner lining. The stitches were fine, but uneven. A tailor, perhaps. Or someone who had learned to mend his own clothes while moving from one place to another. The coroner arrived, breathless, his spectacles fogged. He spoke of the current, of estimated time of death, of what water does to the human body when left adrift overnight. But Moreau heard little of it. His mind was already turning inward, measuring the silence, the precision. The river does not lie, he thought. It keeps what it's given and only gives it back when it is ready. The photographers finished their work, the flashbulbs hissing briefly like dying stars. The body was lifted into the cart, the wheels groaning as they turned toward the morgue. Moreau remained a moment longer on the quay, pipe in hand, watching the light on the river. Across the water, a church bell began its dull tolling. Behind him, the city was waking, tram bells clanging, shutters opening, bakers dragging crates of bread into the street. Life beginning again, indifferent to the man whose absence had already been swallowed. At the morgue, the chill was sharper. Rows of bodies waited in glass cases, the air heavy with disinfectant and the faint metallic tang of cold. Moreau's footsteps echoed softly against the tiles. The attendant, a man with red-rimmed eyes and the patience of one accustomed to grief, led him to the newest arrival. "No identification," he said, flipping through a ledger. "No missing persons to match, nothing yet." Moreau looked at the man's face again. It was neither young nor old, perhaps 40, perhaps less. A face stripped of expression even in death. No trace of fear, only a kind of serenity that felt unnatural. "Was there anything found with him?" Moreau asked. "A cigarette case," the attendant replied. "But empty, no initials." The inspector took it, turning it over in his hand. The metal was smooth, silvered, scratched faintly on one corner as though once dropped on stone. He opened it, sniffed. Faint scent of Balkan tobacco, expensive, though not ostentatious. A man of taste but caution, the kind who buys good things quietly. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, thinning into pale ribbons that caught in the trees along the boulevard. Moreau stepped into the daylight, lighting his pipe. He drew the smoke deep, exhaled, and watched it fade. Somewhere behind the clouds, the city's rhythm had begun again, but his own mind stayed with that face, that nameless man who had entered Paris quietly and left it without a trace. He walked back to the office on foot. The pavements were slick, the air carrying the scent of coffee and wet newsprint. On the corner, near Pont Saint-Michel, a vendor called out the morning headlines: "Foreign Minister returns from Geneva, strike looms in Roubaix, body found in Seine." The words were shouted without curiosity, swallowed instantly by the noise of a passing tram. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridor smelled of coal dust and bureaucracy. Lucas was already at his desk, sleeves rolled up, sorting through reports. The typewriters clicked steadily, an orchestra of monotony that marked another day in the machine of the police. Moreau handed him the cigarette case. "Send it to forensics. Silver, likely foreign. See if they can raise a mark." Lucas nodded, jotting it down. "And the man himself?" "Nothing yet. No fingerprints on record. He's been careful. Or lucky?" He paused, looking out the window toward the grey water that wound its way through the city like a vein. "But he didn't die by accident. There's purpose in it. Precision." Lucas gave a small grunt. "You've said that before. You really think someone killed him only to strip him bare and throw him to the river?" "I think," Moreau said quietly, "that someone wanted to make him disappear, and nearly succeeded." For the rest of the morning, he read reports, cross-checked missing persons, traced the foreign cigarettes through the import registries. Nothing fit. The dead man seemed carved from air. By noon, the inspector's pipe had gone cold. He stared at the stack of papers before him, each page another dead end. In the afternoon, rain began again, thin and steady. The city dimmed under it, lamps lighting early along the quays. Moreau walked to the window, the glass veined with rivulets. Somewhere beyond the mist a siren wailed faintly. River police, perhaps, or an ambulance winding through the boulevards. He found himself thinking of the bruise around the neck, the careful absence of everything else. Death as a deliberate act of erasure. By evening, the morgue attendant sent word there had been a visitor. A woman, middle-aged, who had come asking after a man matching the body's vague description. She had refused to give her name and left without viewing the remains. Only her voice had stayed with the clerk. Soft, foreign, with an accent he could not place. Moreau stood very still when he heard this. "Did she say when she might return?" "No, sir. Only that she'd been mistaken, perhaps." He nodded. But in that simple hesitation, he heard the first break in the silence. A woman who sought a man without name, then fled the moment she drew near the truth. A thread at last, however thin. That night, when the lamps burned low and the corridors of the police building grew quiet, Moreau remained at his desk. His pipe glowed faintly, its smoke curling in lazy spirals toward the ceiling. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the reflections on the Seine until the whole city seemed submerged in its own secrets. In his notebook he wrote only one line. He was meant to vanish, but something went wrong. The ink bled slightly on the paper. Moreau watched it spread, thinking of the man's empty cigarette case, of the bruise that spoke without words, of the woman who had come to look for what she dared not see. The case, still shapeless, had already entered him like a splinter. Something small, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore. He closed the notebook softly, exhaled the last of his smoke, and let the silence settle around him once more. Somewhere in that silence the duel had already begun, though neither man yet knew the other's face. The concierge at 17, Rue de la Gare, wore a shawl the colour of dishwater and a look that suggested she had already judged the moral worth of every man in the district. She peered at Inspector Moreau over the edge of her ledger as if he were another tenant come to complain about the plumbing. The hallway behind her smelled of cabbage, damp stone, and the paraffin from a lamp that smoked whenever the wind pushed under the door. Outside, the rumble of trains from the Austerlitz lines vibrated the window panes with a dull, patient insistence, as if the station were a heart beating beneath the neighbourhood. "You're certain of the description?" she asked, wetting a finger and turning a page. Dark coat, English cut, never gave his name, paid in cash for a week in advance. That one, second floor, back, came late, left early. Always alone? Moreau's voice was mild, his hat held at his side, his eyes taking in the cracked tiles, the scuffed banister, the framed notice about the use of coal in rooms after midnight. "Alone, yes," she said, but her mouth tightened. "Except the once, 2 nights ago. Footsteps after 1, light under the door. The next morning he left before the milkman. He did not look back." Moreau let the silence work on her, the way a fisherman lets the river tug at the line. Behind him, Janvier stood, with the patient boredom of a man who has learned that cases are built out of coughs and sighs and the exact shade of an old woman's suspicion. "He cooked nothing," the concierge added, not because it mattered, but because nothing was ever truly nothing in such buildings. No smell of frying, no soap left in the dish, no brushes hung to dry. He meant to leave as easily as a shadow. Moreau thanked her with a small nod and climbed the stairs. The steps were shallow, the treads worn smooth by thousands of feet. On the landing, the corridor narrowed into dimness. The bulb in the weak ceiling socket had gone, and someone had replaced it with a kerosene lamp whose flame trembled each time the trains shuddered the walls. Room 6 was at the end, the last door before a frosted window that gave a view of the station's roofs and chimneys. The lock gave after a moment's coaxing from Janvier. The room exhaled a faint, closed odour. Dust, damp wool, a breath of tobacco gone stale. Moreau stood without moving, letting his eyes fill slowly with what was there, and, as important, with what was not. A bed of iron with a brown coverlet folded meticulously, a washstand with a cracked jug, a small table under the window, 2 chairs, one with its cane seat sagging, no pictures on the walls, the kind of room that belonged to the city rather than to any person who might inhabit it. He crossed to the table. On it, the concierge's cleaning had left the faint arcs of a rag, but she had not been thorough. In the tiny drift of dust along the window's wooden lip, a straight, fresh line cut through as if a finger had paused there, tracing the air before withdrawing. Near the finger line lay a matchstick, burnt only a third, its head blackened but intact at the edge where flame had failed to catch. He lifted it by the unburned end and held it to his nose. A resinous scent, a little sweeter than the common kind. Not a French make, he thought. The dead man's cigarette case had whispered of balcon leaves. This match could be a companion from the same careful world. Janvier was already on his knees by the washstand, his handkerchief wrapped over his fingertips. He reached under the basin and brought out a shaving brush that had been rinsed too clean, the bristles combed as if for inspection. "No blade," he said, and his eyes flicked to the inspectors. They were both thinking of the bruise like a half-ring. Moreau tried the wardrobe. Inside hung a single shirt, clean but mended at the cuff, and a waistcoat whose lining had been opened and sewn again with a hurried, hunted care. He pressed the seams, feeling for the stiffness of paper. Nothing. He ran his hand along the top shelf and came away with a ghost of chalky plaster and the grainy grit of time. There are rooms that keep histories like old men keep anecdotes, poorly and with a desire to embellish. This was not such a room. It had been opened, inhabited, and then smoothed behind as a hand smooths the surface of water after dropping a stone. Yet the water remembers, Moreau thought. It remembers in circles. He bent to the floorboards. A sliver of wax glittered near the bed leg. Not from the lamp. This wax was pale and fine, the sort used in small candles favoured by travellers who like their light discreet. He pictured the scene without instructing himself to do so. The man seated at the table, the candle on a saucer, the flame shaded against the curtain, the window a rectangle of darkness, the train breath beyond like a very large animal sleeping. Someone comes. The match fails. A second match? He scanned the table again and found the tiny crescent blister in the wood where a droplet of hot wax had fallen and cooled. He touched it, and it lifted away whole. On the underside, a ghost of fibre. A hair? No, a thread. Fine. The exact colour of the red used to bind official envelopes at certain ministries. "Sir," Janvier said softly. He had kneaded the sagging seat of the chair with the care of a baker testing dough. Now he turned it and showed the underside. Pinned beneath with a sliver of steel was a ticket stub, torn neatly, not lost, but hidden. Moreau took it and smoothed it flat in his palm. Third class. Angoulême to Paris. 2 days past, a train that arrives before dawn, bringing men who do not wish to be noticed. "Send that to Lucas," Moreau said, "and ask him to find the conductor who worked that number. He'll be dozing in a café near Gare d'Austerlitz by now, complaining about the draft under the door. He'll remember if anyone travelled with a quiet coat and no name." "And this?" Janvier held the match in a pinch. "I'll get the box from the tobacconist. They can tell by the cut." "Yes." Moreau kept the thread of red wax in his other hand, a small ribbon of suggestion that tied itself to a corridor at the quay where official seals were pressed and opened and never spoken of unless the air was very still. He had no right to the thought, he allowed it anyway, with the caution that separates intuition from folly. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the bed, the washstand, the careful emptiness. For a moment, the room filled itself around him with the presence of the man, the scrape of a chair leg, the soft cough into a handkerchief, the slow, practised folding of a coat over the narrow foot of the bed so as not to crease it. He could almost hear the candle's tiny wick fussing in its own flame. Then the second presence intruded, without sound and yet with complete certainty, the way a shadow enters a room whose door you have not heard open. A visitor who leaves no scent but changes the air. There had been words, perhaps, but not many. The match fails. Silence afterward, a silence with weight. A train called from the station, a drawn-out note that seemed to come from a long distance and right at the window pane at once. The lamplight quivered. Moreau stood, suddenly tired, and crossed to the washstand. He lifted the jug as if the dead man might have done so that last night, and the base of it came away with the small, surprising sound of gum releasing from wood. When he turned it, he saw what the gum had held, a square of paper, no larger than the palm of his hand, the edges cut with a careful knife. The paper had once been folded, refolded, carried. On it, written in ink that had bled just slightly, as if the writer had hesitated too long, were 5 words, a name and a street, and then a final word that was only a letter, crossed out and written again. Madame Lise Vautrin, Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques, 7S. The S had been corrected to something that might have been an L, then left as a shape between letters, a retreat from certainty. He read it twice. The name meant nothing to him, but the street did. It hugged the backside of Paris like a memory, close to the university, to old stone, to rooms where students learned to forget their father's trades. The hand that wrote the name had been precise and yet unsure of itself at the end. A man composing a message to a woman he did not dare to address properly. Madame Vautrin, Janvier repeated, committing it to the small ledger he kept clipped in his pocket. Do we go now? Not yet. Moreau slid the square back under the jug with the gum, not to leave it, but to learn the feeling of returning a secret to its place. We go to the station first. The line leaves traces on the men who carry it. He glanced at the match and the red thread. And then to a tobacconist who is too proud to sell cheap fire. They locked the door behind them and returned along the corridor. The kerosene lamp made a small noise like a mouse dreaming. On the stairs, the concierge waited with an eagerness she tried to present as indifference. You found nothing, she said, not as a question, but the tilt of her head betrayed her hunger. We found a man who took care to be no one, Moreau said. How carefully he failed may matter. In this house, she said, drawing her shawl closer, no one fails carefully. They simply fail. It was offered as a piece of philosophy and as a defense of her stairway's honor. Outside, on the pavement, she lowered her voice. There was another thing. Last night, a lady called at this door. She asked if a gentleman lodged here who went out before the milkman. She did not come in. She wore gloves and carried an umbrella, though it had not rained since noon. Red. One does not forget it. Moreau looked at her in a way that did not move his face, but that changed the color of his attention. Did she give a name? She gave only the absence of a name. That was her courtesy. They stood for a moment in the threshold, breathing the smell of coal smoke and wet wool and the flat, honest odor of the street. The station sent up a short grunt of steam. Moreau imagined the umbrella in the concierge's doorway, red against the brown of the banister, red against the washed-out papers pasted on the wall. An impossible color for someone who wished to pass unremarked. Unless the umbrella was a shield. Unless the courage to be seen was the last refuge of the careful. He and Janvier crossed to the cafe opposite, where drivers in blue caps stood at the zinc counter, swallowing coffee like a duty. The proprietor polished glasses with a vigor that made the shelves ring. In the corner, under a print of a fishing village gone yellow with time, a man with the pale eyes of someone who knew the timetable of every train without looking at a clock sat over a bowl of wine. He wore the grease of engines on his cuffs like a habit he had long ceased to resent. Conductor on the Angoulême run, the proprietor said to Moreau before he asked, because cafes at stations know what men the police come to see. That one keeps his tickets as if they were letters from a girl he once believed in. The conductor did not look surprised when Moreau took the ticket stub from his pocketbook and laid it on the table. He touched the paper with one fingertip, not to claim it, but to compute the weight of the past it carried. That car was light, he said. Third class, more empty than usual. There was a gentleman in an English coat who sat near the door and did not sleep. He looked out at the dark as if it might speak to him. He had hands that knew work, but not recently. He changed trains the way a man changes rooms in a house he used to own. Alone? Moreau asked. Alone when he boarded, the conductor said, turning the rim of his bowl slowly. But at Limoges, a lady came in and sat 2 benches away. She did not look at him. That is how I knew they were not strangers. What did she carry? An umbrella, he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched, not in amusement, but with the memory of a detail that had stayed like a pebble in the shoe since the journey. The colour of a wound before it darkens. Moreau thanked him and slid a few francs across the table in a way that was neither a bribe nor a charity, but a recognition that men who carry timetables also carry truths that have no column. Outside, the station sent another breath into the air, and the sky over the roofs wore the grey that Paris keeps for evenings when it has not decided whether to rain. They walked back toward the river. The inspector's pipe sat unlit in his pocket. The match in Janvier's envelope still waited to be compared. At the corner, a boy ran past with a folded newspaper and a shout. Moreau did not catch the headline. He was listening to the sound the city made when it failed to say a name. He looked up at the line of windows, each a small stage where a life performed its evening rituals. Somewhere behind one pane, a woman might be drawing the silk off her hands, laying a red umbrella to rest by the door. Somewhere behind another, a man might be pressing a square of paper into gum and hiding it beneath a jug because he could not bear to post it nor yet to destroy it. There are rooms that keep nothing. There are rooms that keep the exact measure of a silence. He thought of the bruise around the throat and the careful excision of labels and watch and wallet, the choice that makes a man vanish, not by leaving, but by being left. And in his mind he saw 2 chairs in a small room, placed as if to negotiate a truce neither person believed in. He did not assign them words. He did not need to. He only felt the precise moment when the presence of one person became heavier than the presence of the other. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps were lit in the corridor, and the familiar ink and coal smell greeted him like a tired dog lifting its head. Lucas had already returned a note in his taut, slanting hand. The cigarette case bore a smoothed engraving, the ghost of initials polished nearly to extinction. The silver was Belgian. A tobacconist near the Odeon confirmed that the match was of a brand imported in small quantities through Antwerp. Men who used them liked their fire to light only when asked politely. Another note sat beneath. A clerk at the posties mentioned, off the record, a woman of poise who had stood at the counter with a telegram half written, then torn it in 2 and left without sending. She had carried a red umbrella. Moreau read the notes without haste, as if the case had all the time in the world. Then he took his pen and wrote a single line under the address rescued from the gum. Madame Lise Vautrin may be the silence the river could not keep. He capped the pen and leaned back, the muscles between his shoulders complaining at last. In the window, the Seine showed itself in a strip, ink dark, purposeful. Somewhere, a bell, perhaps from Saint-Sulpice, counted out the hour in a voice older than the police and the station and the red umbrella together. He put on his hat. "Come," he said to Janvier, whose coat was already on because men who follow learn to anticipate footsteps. "We will call on Madame Vautrin before the night takes the city back. If she is at home, we will listen. If she is not, we will listen to her absence." The words made no drama of themselves. They did not need to. The night would supply whatever grace their plainness lacked. Outside, the air tasted of rain. The lamps along the quays burned with the steady patience of men who have known rivers all their lives. And as they turned their steps toward the Latin Quarter, the duel that had begun in the room without memory adjusted its distance by a pace, no more, no less, like 2 fencers finding the length of each other's reach in the first minute before the blades truly speak. The street of the Fossé Saint-Jacques lies folded between the old Latin Quarter and the shadows of the Pantheon, where the air carries the smell of damp stone and the faint echo of church bells that have long forgotten their purpose. It was nearing 7 when Moreau reached number 7, a building with a facade so narrow that one might mistake it for an afterthought wedged between larger ambitions. The concierge, a silent man with a wool scarf knotted too tightly, pointed to the second floor without asking questions. Paris had learned long ago that the men who arrive at dusk wearing the calm of the Quai des Orfèvres were not to be delayed with curiosity. The stair creaked like an old throat clearing itself. Outside, the rain began again, soft and uncertain, tapping against the windows in hesitant rhythm. The door opened before he could knock twice. The woman who stood there was not young, yet neither was she old. Her face carried the strange, untraceable beauty of those who have outlived their illusions, but not their pride. The red umbrella leaned against the wall behind her, still damp, its fabric catching the dim lamplight like a muted flame. "Madame Vautrin?" Her eyes hesitated, then confirmed him with a small nod. "You are from the police," she said, not as a question. Her voice was low, trained to hide tremors. "I am Inspector Moreau." He removed his hat. "You were acquainted with a man who lodged recently near the Gare d'Austerlitz." She stepped aside wordlessly, allowing him in. The room smelled of lavender and faint tobacco. It was tidy, lived in with care. A small fire burned in the grate, and beside it a sewing basket sat open, as if she had been mending something when the past decided to knock upon her door. "I know why you've come," she said finally. "I read the papers. They describe no name, but the river tells its own stories." Moreau remained standing. He looked at the photographs on the mantel. Small, framed, none recent. A man in uniform, a young woman at a seaside promenade, both worn with the fading of memory. "The man in the river," she continued, her voice thin, "was once called André." "His family name?" She shook her head. I doubt even he remembered it. He had others, depending on the season and the work. To me, he was only André. Moreau studied her. The tremor in her hands betrayed an old wound reopening. "How did you know him?" "I met him in Angoulême years ago, before the war took sense from men. He came to rent a room above the bakery where I worked. He was kind but never open. He laughed as if apologizing for it. He stayed a year, then left one morning without a word. I thought him dead until last week." "Last week?" Moreau leaned slightly forward. She crossed to the table and picked up a folded piece of paper, already creased and refolded too many times. "He sent this. No address, only a return mark from the south. It came the day before he died." She handed it to him. The paper was thin, the handwriting deliberate, almost hesitant. A craftsman's hand. "Lisa, I'm coming to Paris. There is something I must make right. If you still think of me, leave the light burning after dusk." Moreau read it twice. "Did you?" "Yes," she said softly. "For 3 nights." He looked at the letter again. The ink, faintly smudged, bore the trace of hesitation at every line. It was not the letter of a man running from the law. It was the letter of a man preparing to meet it. "Did he visit you?" A pause, heavy and private. "He came the night before the river found him. I heard the knock after midnight. He stood at the door, hat in hand, wet from the rain. He looked thinner, older. There was a weariness that went beyond the body. I let him in." The fire crackled. Moreau said nothing, only waited. "He did not sit," she continued. "He said he had to speak quickly, that something had followed him from the south. He spoke of a man, unnamed, who had once trusted him with money, or a secret, or both. He said the man would not forgive, that he was near." Her eyes flicked to the window. Outside, the fog thickened again, crawling low along the street. "I begged him to stay," she whispered. But he smiled, that same apology in the smile, and said he must go to the river, that it would be finished there. Moreau felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Did he name his pursuer? No. Only that he had lived too long as a ghost. The inspector drew the cigarette case from his pocket and placed it gently on the table. Do you recognize this? Her hand trembled as she touched it. Yes, it was his. I gave it to him the day he left Angoulême. He said he would carry it until he no longer could. He kept his promises that way, quietly, hopelessly. Moreau looked around the room again. The fire threw small, wavering shadows on the wallpaper. On the mantel, a clock ticked with the patience of something that had heard too many confessions. "There is another man," he said at last. "A conductor saw a woman on the train from Angoulême to Paris, a woman with a red umbrella. You understand why I ask?" Her breath caught, but her eyes did not flinch. "Yes, Inspector, it was I. I followed him. Not to betray him, to protect him. I thought he might harm himself. But at Limoges, he saw me. I pretended to sleep. When I woke, he was gone. At Austerlitz, I watched him step into the fog. He did not look back." "Did you follow him from the station?" She hesitated. "For a while. Then I lost him near the river. There was a man in a dark hat walking the same path, always a few steps behind. I thought it coincidence until I saw them stop beneath the bridge." Moreau's eyes sharpened. "You saw them?" "Only silhouettes. Then a carriage passed. When I looked again, there was only one man." The fire sighed. Moreau's hand rested on the back of a chair, steadying the moment. "You're certain?" "As certain as a woman can be when fear distorts sight. I ran. I could not bear to see what came next." He nodded slowly. "And this man in the hat, could you describe him?" She thought, her brow tightening. "Tall. A limp in his left leg, perhaps from an old wound. He moved like someone who once marched but now hides the habit." A soldier, Moreau thought. The South, the erased name, the precision of the killing. It formed, not clearly, but enough for the edges to begin showing. He rose to leave, and she followed him to the door. "Inspector," she said, "if you find him, the one who did this, will you tell me?" "I will tell you what can be told," he replied. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. He paused under the eaves and looked back. Through the window, her figure stood motionless, the red umbrella now hanging by the hearth like a wound drying in the light. Janvier waited near the carriage, collar turned up. "Anything?" "Enough to know we're not chasing a ghost," Moreau said, "only a man who's learned how to walk like one." They moved through the wet streets, the wheels hissing against cobblestones. The gas lamps flickered, reflected in the puddles like trembling moons. Moreau lit his pipe, the flame flaring, briefly before surrendering to the damp air. "What do you make of her?" Janvier asked. "A woman living between two silences, the one she shared with him and the one he left her with." "And the man with the limp?" "That," Moreau said, exhaling slowly, "is the shadow the river was trying to hide." He looked out at the city, its rooftops glistening like wet slate, its alleys alive with whispers the law could never fully silence. Somewhere in that labyrinth walked a man who had erased his own past so perfectly that even death had struggled to identify him. Yet now the silence was cracking. The duel had drawn its first line. And as the carriage turned toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the inspector's reflection in the rain-streaked window merged with the dark shapes of the city. A man chasing another version of himself through the fog, each bound by secrets they could neither confess nor forget. Morning entered the Quai des Orfèvres like a reluctant witness, bringing with it the scratch of pens, the chattering fatigue of typewriters, and the smell of coffee boiled too long. Rain tapped on the window panes with the persistence of a petitioner who refuses to leave. The river outside moved with its usual sober purpose, indifferent to what the city asked of it. Inside, men who had not slept enough lowered their heads over paper and pretended that paper obeyed them. Moreau hung his hat on the peg beside his door and allowed the office to claim him as if he were merely another piece of furniture finally returned to its place. Lucas had arrived before him. His sleeves were rolled, his tie already crooked in the way work makes a man honest. "The match," he said without prologue, laying a small box upon the desk, "is of a Belgian brand brought in through Antwerp. The tobacconist near the Odeon remembered selling 3 boxes to a man who spoke little, paid exactly, and avoided the mirror. He described the customer as neither young nor old, a coat of English cut, hands that were not a clerk's." Moreau lifted the box, thumb grazing the paper label, where a seahorse floated above a cursive name. He thought of the unfinished match in the room near the station and of the candle that burned just enough to make a silence visible. "And the cigarette case?" "Belgian silver, as we guessed. The jeweller found the ghost of initials beneath the polish, AV. The second letter could be a trick of light. He'll try with acid, but promises nothing." "Or AL," Janvier offered from the doorway, rain on his hat brim, spitting onto the stone. "The letter on the paper under the water jug refused to be born." Moreau nodded. He had learned to respect hesitant letters. They told more than the neat ones. He set the matchbox down and drew the square of paper from his inner pocket, the address to Madame Lise Vautrin on Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques, as plain as a confession. He placed it beside the box. 2 small objects on a desk, and between them the entire weight of a man's unchosen life. Files were brought in, not because they would speak, but because bureaucracy demanded that silence be surrounded by paper until it surrendered. Lucas spread them with a care that was almost ecclesiastical, missing persons with no useful sorrow to attach them, notices from foreign consulates typed by clerks who disliked their superiors in 8 languages, memoranda from ministries where important men had read carefully and then forgotten to remember. And through it all, the rain kept time. "At the morgue," Lucas said, 2 men came this morning. One thought the dead man was a waiter who had owed him money. The other hoped he was his son. They left with their suits wet and their faces empty. Neither recognized him. "Send them both home with dry coffee," Moreau said. "They will need something to hold." "Already done?" Lucas closed a folder and opened another. "There is something from the Postes. Our friend at the Odeon, who prides himself on remembering women of poise, says a telegram was drafted and destroyed late yesterday, addressed to Angoulême. The message, he claims, contained only 4 words before it was torn. He has found me." Then she left, carrying the umbrella we are not to forget. He offers this not as sworn fact, but as the gift of a man who has stood too long behind a counter, watching people decide what they dare to say. "It is enough," Moreau said. "Rumour is a form of handwriting." Janvier set a damp envelope on the blotter. "From Angoulême, station master's reply to our inquiry about the 3rd-class ticket." Moreau slit it, with the instinctive neatness of a man who dislikes unnecessary disorder. The letter smelled faintly of the dust that lives on railway timetables. It told him that 2 mornings ago a man with an English coat had purchased a 3rd class to Paris in cash. He had a slight hitch in the left leg, not quite a limp, but the kind that says once the body belonged to the army. The station master swore no more than that his memory did not lie unless asked. Moreau folded the letter and felt the room tilt. The shadow on the embankment had a limb at last. "We are not dealing with a ghost," he said, not triumphantly, but as one admits that a road extends beyond the next bend. A clerk from records arrived, carrying a stack with the particular piety of his trade. He laid it upon the desk and withdrew, the way good priests leave confidences alone. Lucas opened the top file. War lists, men discharged without ceremony, men pensioned poorly, men who returned to towns that had become strangers and to families grown cautious in their absence. The names blurred into one long proof that a country survives by forgetting the exact day it asked its sons to become old. "What are we looking for?" Janvier asked, not because he expected an answer, but because the question was the thread that kept them from drifting. "A wound. That became a manner," Moreau said, and a manner that learned to hide in crowds. He turned the pages, his forefinger ticking off the columns. A man known to have served in the south, Toulon, Marseille, Bordeaux. Routes that teach the feet to prefer stations and keys to piazzas and fields. They found nothing certain because certainty was not the day's currency, but a thin line began to show between places and the taste of tobacco and the red thread that might have sealed a letter once. The line ran from Antwerp to Angoulême to Paris, and along it walked two men who had, at different times, chosen to be someone else. By noon, the lamps had to be lit. The sky had flattened into the grey that makes Paris appear both older and more honest. Men drifted into the corridor with sandwiches they did not enjoy. A messenger in a cap bringing a sealed pouch looked around with the awe of entering a church during Vespers. He left as if forgiven. Moreau signed where he had to and opened what he wished to read. Inside, a note from the prefecture, written in a hand that preferred speed over elegance, warned that a foreign consulate had inquired vaguely about a man matching their dead man's description. The consulate's secretary, a certain Henri Delmas, a Frenchman employed abroad but loaned back to Paris to tidy their embarrassments, had requested, without requesting, to be informed of any developments. His office lay on a quiet street near the Parc Monceau, where flags moved very little because the wind there had less work to do. "Delmas," Lucas said, letting the name rest in the room like a coin on a table. "You know him?" "We have exchanged politeness in hallways," Moreau said. "He keeps his hair as carefully as he keeps his secrets. Men like that dislike wet days." He set the note aside. "If he has taken an interest, then our dead man was either inconvenient to someone polite or useful to someone impolite, perhaps both." A boy from the laboratory arrived with his boots squeaking and his pride only partly concealed. He brought a small envelope sealed with brown gummed paper and the smell of spirits. Inside lay a thread, a true thread now, not the one Moreau had imagined, from the wax he had lifted in the room. It was finer than it had seemed, with a twist that suggested it had once been part of a larger braid. The notation pinned to it offered an opinion. Such threads were used to bind official packets when the wax alone did not satisfy a nervous sender. The hand that wrote the notation had underlined no words but had lingered over official in a way that turned it into an overtone rather than a conclusion. "War or justice?" Janvier said. "Sometimes they borrow each other's stationery," Lucas replied. The afternoon thinned into a kind of light that had less to do with time than with endurance. Men who had thought themselves indispensable went home to their dinners, and those who knew they were not indispensable stayed. The river darkened as if ink had been poured into it. Moreau read through 3 statements that cancelled one another in polite ways. He refused 2 invitations to consider an easy solution and accepted 1 coffee that had forgotten it was ever a bean. A telegram arrived for him personally, carried by a messenger whose cap had lost its sheen. The boy's cheeks were red from the rain. The paper crackled in Moreau's hands the way nerves do in men who have had to wait. It was from a sergent de ville in Angoulême who had found a landlord willing to remember the dead man from years earlier. The landlord provided a name without swearing to it, André Valade. A name like a coat borrowed without fitting. The sergeant added, almost as a postscript, that a one-legged veteran, a man known as Caporal Beraud in the cafes, though whether that was his true rank no one cared to check, had asked, after Valade's return 3 days before the train south became a train north. The veteran spoke little, paid in exact coins, and once ran a finger around his collar as if remembering something that had hurt. He limped on the left. The room held still around the telegram. Rain softened its fists against the glass. Moreau placed the paper flat upon the desk and drew a line beneath the 2 names. He did not declare victory. He did not declare anything. "We will see if Caporal Beraud drinks in Paris the way he drank in Angoulême," he said. Men carry their habits as carefully as their scars. Where do we begin? Janvier asked. In places where men with old wounds go to sit unseen, Moreau said. Near the stations, near the river, in cafes where the zinc counter is polished for the comfort of elbows that remember rifles, and near Parc Monceau, where a politely curious secretary named Delmas adjusts his tie in reflective glass and tells himself he is not paid to be surprised. Lucas lifted his coat from the peg. Shall I have a word with Delmas first? Not yet, Moreau answered. If he wishes to help, he will call it cooperation. If he wishes not to, he will call it courtesy. For now, let him experience the sensation of not knowing whether we have something he wants. They went out briefly into the corridor's hum. A woman from records passed with a folder hugged to her chest. Her shoes made no sound at all. The lamps burned steadily, their halos making islands on the ceiling. A janitor moved his broom with a care that suggested the corners mattered to him more than they did to anyone else. The quay was a vessel that contained all manners of silence. In the early evening, a man presented himself in the outer office. He wore a shabby coat that had once been handsome, and he held his cap crushed in both hands, as if squeezing it might produce the courage he had almost enough of. His name, when he gave it, was Gérard Sauvé, a clerk at a shipping firm down by the river. He said he had read of the body and had recognized the description of the cigarette case. A gentleman, he said carefully, left such a case upon my desk 3 days ago when he came to ask whether any parcels had arrived from Belgium addressed to A.V. No consignments matched. He thanked me and left. I remembered the way he touched the edge of the desk when he stood up, a man who expected pain from moving. Limp? Moreau asked. A hitch, Sauvé corrected, as if the body had been taught to respect an old lesson and had not forgotten, even when it was tired. Did he give a name? He gave none. He showed me a telegram that had been folded and unfolded so often that its words had almost rubbed out. I could not read it. He kept the crease between his fingers as if it steadied him. Moreau led him through the questions calmly, as if the answers were waiting patiently for the right tone. Sauvé left with his cap still crushed, and a receipt for his time that said the police recognized the cost of remembering. When the door closed, Lucas said, "Parcels from Belgium for A.V., that nearly allows the initials to stand upright." "Nearly," Moreau said. "Names are like keys that have been used too often. They turn in locks they were not made for." He looked out at the river. The lamps along the quay had taken on their nighttime shrug. The water carried its small reflections downstream, indifferent to their origins. He stood and retrieved his hat. "Janvier, we will begin with the cafes around Austerlitz and then drift along the river to the bridges. Keep your eyes for a man whose left shoe has worn a different story than his right. Lucas, have someone watch Delmas's door, not to frighten him, not to flatter him, only to learn how many coats come and go while he polishes his manners." "And if we meet this Barreau?" Janvier asked. "We will ask him where he learned to walk the way he does," Moreau said. "We will ask softly." They went down the stairs together. The building groaned with evening. Outside, the rain had become a fine, even veil, the sort that erases edges and gives the city a single texture. The lamps burned with a steady patience. Somewhere a bell counted 7, then 8, and then gave up, as if the hour did not wish to be named. The river smelled of iron and the faint bitterness of leaves bruised by water. At the door, a telegraph boy stepped into their path with the self-importance boys wear when the words they carry do not belong to them. He held out the slip. Moreau opened it under the lamp. 4 words only, and then the signature smudged by haste. "He waits by the bridge." The sender named himself the conductor of the Angoulême run. He had, he said, recognized the man with the limp on the embankment near Pont de la Tournelle at dusk, moving like a pilgrim who knows precisely how long the way to his destination is. Moreau folded the telegram and put it in his breast pocket. The rain continued with its even hand. He turned up his collar, and without ceremony or speech, he and Janvier took the steps down to the quay, where the city sheds its other voices and listens to its own breathing. The journey south began beneath a bruised sky. Clouds hung low over the Gare d'Austerlitz, turning the glass roof into a dull mirror where the lamps trembled like tired eyes. The train's iron breath mingled with the smell of oil and soot. Pigeons flurried from the rafters as the whistle cut through the damp air. Moreau boarded quietly, his overcoat collar raised, his suitcase light enough to suggest that certainty weighed more than luggage. Janvier followed with 2 notebooks and a thermos of coffee that had already surrendered its warmth. They found seats in an empty compartment. Outside, the platform slid backward, dissolving into mist and brick. Paris retreated in slow fragments. First the warehouses, then the chimneys, then only the grey horizon that carried its memory. The inspector leaned his head against the window, watching reflections chase one another through the glass, like thoughts too cautious to speak aloud. For a long time, neither man said a word. The rhythm of the train carried its own reasoning, steady, mechanical, unhurried, as if time itself had fallen asleep on the tracks. Moreau took out the telegram from the conductor, the words fading slightly from the folds. He waits by the bridge. The ink had bled where rain had touched it, as though the paper itself had shivered. Janvier shifted. You think this Caporal Béraud followed him south before? I think, Moreau said slowly, that some debts refuse to stay buried. Men like Béraud don't kill for money, they kill to tidy memory. The countryside began to unfurl, wet fields gleaming under weak daylight. Villages appeared and vanished. A steeple here, a shuttered bakery there, smoke rising from chimneys like muted confessions. Moreau's pipe rested between his fingers unlit. He preferred the weight of it to the smoke. At Poitiers, the conductor knocked softly and entered. The same man from before, eyes pale from sleeplessness, hands smelling faintly of brass polish. Inspector, he said, I wired as you asked. The man you seek boarded the southbound local 2 days ago, 1 stop short of Angoulême. He carried a valise, nothing else. Sat alone, never removed his hat. Moreau nodded. And when he arrived? He went toward the quarter by the river, the docks, cheap lodgings, cheaper company. But he left again the next morning, before light. The innkeeper said he paid with foreign notes, Belgian perhaps. Thank you. Moreau pressed a folded bill into the man's hand. One more thing. Did he speak? The conductor hesitated. Only once. When I offered to move him from the draft, he said, some winds must be faced. I thought him a poet or a lunatic. Now I think he was simply resigned. The train swayed. Moreau closed his eyes, for a moment, letting the phrase settle. Some winds must be faced. It was not bravado. It was confession. By the time they reached Angoulême, evening had thickened into the kind of dusk that belongs to small towns. The streets empty, the air holding the faint perfume of rain on cobblestone. The station-master, a man whose moustache seemed older than his face, greeted them with the solemnity reserved for Paris officials. He led them through a narrow passage that smelled of coal and disinfectant, speaking in low tones as if afraid the walls might report him. Yes, I remember him, he said. Arrived with the 9:15 from Bordeaux, paid cash, no baggage tag, he stood there by the clock, waiting for someone who never came. After 10 minutes, he walked out to the street without looking back. Strange sort of calm about him, like a man who's already heard the verdict. Moreau followed him outside. The lamps along the station road glowed faintly amber through the drizzle. Beyond them, the town stretched in terraces of roofs and chimneys, a faint halo of smoke above it all. Somewhere down those wet streets, André Valade had walked for the last time as a man among men. They took rooms at the Hôtel du Lion d'Or, a place where wallpaper peeled with discretion and the stair banisters smelled faintly of vinegar. The proprietor, a stout woman with a scar over her knuckle, remembered both names, Valade and Moreau, as if they belonged to opposite sides of a single story. "Yes, the caporal was here," she said, polishing a glass that needed no polishing. "A quiet one. Walked as if the ground didn't trust him. He drank only cider, left early, came back late. Always with the same question. Had anyone asked for him? A man with an English coat and foreign tobacco. I told him no," he smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't move the eyes. "And Valade?" She frowned. "He came the night before, asked for a room facing the river, paid for one night, said he had business that couldn't wait till morning. When I asked if it was pleasure or duty, he said, 'What's the difference when it's the last thing a man must do?' He was polite, tired. The sort of man who tips without remembering he's done it." "Did they meet?" "If they did not do it here. But one left after midnight, the other before dawn. The street between their rooms was wet with rain, but no footprints, only the dogs barked. Moreau thanked her and went upstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of old linen and wood polish. He entered Valade's former room, small, overlooking the dark ribbon of the Charente River. The shutters creaked when he opened them. Across the water, factory chimneys rose like silent witnesses against the night. He crossed to the table beneath the window. The candle there had burned nearly to the stub. Melted wax had pooled, hardened, and cracked. A small geography of thought. He touched the surface. It flaked away. Beneath it, a faint circle where something once rested. Perhaps a glass, perhaps a ring. But near the edge of the table, faint yet deliberate, were 3 words scratched into the wood. "Ask Delmas again." He traced the letters with his thumb. Delmas, the polite consular secretary in Paris whose hair refused disorder. So the South and the capital were not separate chapters, but one line written in 2 hands. The Belgian connection, the matchstick, the letter, unsent. They all bent toward the same name. When Janvier entered, Moreau was still standing by the window. "You've found something," Janvier said, reading his silence. "A reminder," Moreau murmured. "Written for a man who knew he would not get to read it twice." Janvier stepped closer. "The prefecture will want a report. The prefecture will get a story when the story knows its ending." He turned to the view again. Across the river, the faint hum of a barge engine echoed through the fog. Somewhere down the quay, a dog barked once, then again, then fell quiet. They walked later to the riverside cafe the innkeeper had mentioned, a small place called Le Fer. Inside, the light was low and the smell of wine hung thick as breath. A few men sat hunched over their glasses, their talk in murmurs, the air dense with the resignation of those who have nothing left to invent about their lives. The barman looked up as they entered. "Caporal Moreau," Moreau said softly. "Did he come here often?" The man shrugged. "Every evening, sat by the door, where he could see the river, spoke to no one. Once I heard him mutter about the tide. Said it reminded him of a man he used to know. I asked if the man was dead. He said not yet." "Did he leave anything behind?" The barman reached under the counter and produced a folded scrap of paper, its corners stained with wine. "Found this under his chair 2 nights ago. Thought it was nothing." Moreau unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was angular, almost military in precision. "A man without past carries his own rope." He stared at the words for a long time. "Where is he now?" "Gone," said the barman. "Left before dawn yesterday, limped to the station, bought a ticket north, said Paris owed him an answer." The inspector's pulse steadied. The duel had circled back to where it began. He could almost see it. The figure with the limp crossing the bridge at dawn, the other already waiting by the river's edge. A debt paid in silence. When they returned to the inn, Moreau wrote one line in his notebook before extinguishing the lamp. Two men, one seeking forgiveness, the other the shape of it. Outside, the night pressed against the shutters. The river whispered in the dark, repeating its secret to anyone who dared to listen. And in that whisper, Moreau began to understand that what tied killer and victim together was not hatred, but remembrance, the kind that neither death nor water could wash clean. He closed his notebook and leaned back in the chair, letting the murmur of the river cradle the thoughts that refused to sleep. Somewhere in Paris, Delmas was already expecting his name to be spoken aloud. And when it was, the city itself would listen. The night train carried them back toward Paris through a darkness that seemed to think. Fields unrolled outside like ink poured on glass, and every time the wheels struck a joint in the rails, the sound came like the closing of a box meant for something fragile. Janvier slept in short bursts, his hat tilted forward, the notebook still open on his lap. Moreau did not sleep at all. He sat facing the window, the reflection of his own face pale and divided by the smears of rain. Somewhere ahead, the city waited. The city that never forgives a man for returning with the wrong kind of truth. He took the folded scrap from his coat pocket again, the one he had found beneath the candle wax, asked Delmas again. The words had been cut into the wood with patience, not anger. Men write differently when they know time has become a luxury. The line had the tone of a plea disguised as instruction. Dawn met them halfway between Poitiers and Étampes. Pale light leaked through the windows, touching Janvier's face and the smoke-streaked upholstery with a gentleness that the city would soon ruin. When they stepped onto the platform at Austerlitz, the air smelled of coal and wet stone. Moreau turned his collar up and looked toward the river. The wind from the Seine carried with it something that felt like warning. By 9, they were back at the Quai des Orfèvres. The corridors seemed narrower, the desks smaller. Files had grown in their absence, multiplying like weeds. Lucas met them halfway, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "Delmas telephoned twice," he said. "He insists on speaking with you in person, claims it concerns a matter of discretion that cannot be postponed." Moreau removed his gloves slowly. "When a man insists on discretion, it means his conscience has begun to sweat. Tell him I'll call on him at 4. He spent the morning reading reports that offered less than silence. A watchman on the Pont de la Tournelle had seen a man matching Béraud's limp 2 nights ago, staring down at the water as if waiting for something to surface. The man had stayed until dawn, then vanished before the first tram. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just presence as deliberate as absence. At noon, a small envelope arrived from the laboratory. Inside lay a page, browned at the edges, its handwriting barely visible through the stains. The note had been discovered folded inside the lining of Vallad's coat, overlooked, almost erased. The handwriting was the same as the letter to Madame Vautrin, though the ink trembled as if written under strain. Moreau read it twice, his eyes narrowing. "If I do not return, you will know I have paid. There are things we borrow in war that peace will not forgive. I could not remain the man he remembers me to be." No signature, no date, only the faint impression of a pressed seal long since dissolved. He lit his pipe and let the smoke coil upward in grey spirals. "Lucas," he said quietly, "send a man to the consulate. Observe who comes and who leaves. If Delmas meets anyone before 4, note it. And Janvier, go to Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques. Tell Madame Vautrin she should not leave her apartment today. Say it as if it were courtesy, not protection." By the time Moreau stepped into the afternoon, the sky had cleared just enough to make the Seine shimmer like dull metal. He walked north, past the bouquinistes packing away their damp books, past lovers leaning against the parapets, past the smell of roasted chestnuts and the faint hum of accordions that never seemed to stop. The consulate near Parc Monceau stood like a mausoleum of manners. tall windows, immaculate drapes, and guards who watched the world through the glass without appearing to breathe. Delmas received him in an office that looked more like a confession room than a workspace. The blinds were half drawn, the desk too polished, the air thick with the perfume of wax and denial. He rose from behind his papers with a smile that failed to travel as far as his eyes. "My dear Inspector," he said, "Paris grows darker each time you visit." "Then you must open more windows," Moreau replied. They exchanged the courtesies required by men who distrust each other too well to be rude. Then Moreau placed the cigarette case on the desk. "You know this, I believe." Delmas's expression did not move, but his hand twitched. A small betrayal. "I've seen many such things. Not this one. It belonged to a man who wrote your name on a table in Angoulême before someone helped him into the river." The secretary looked up. "You accuse me?" "I inquire," said Moreau. "Accusation is for men who've finished listening." Delmas smiled thinly. "Then you should know that André Valade once worked for the consulate, an assistant courier. We used him for errands across the border. He was quick, discreet, and, how shall I put it, less curious than most. But after the war, he began selling what he should have been delivering. Names, schedules, nothing dramatic, only small leaks. Someone in Antwerp paid him well for information about shipments and coded letters. When we discovered it, he vanished." "And Caporal Béraud?" Delmas shrugged, lighting a cigarette with the slow grace of a man who has practiced deceit so long it feels like art. "A soldier, also once on our list. Used for errands of another kind. Discipline problems, drink, pride, the usual. We gave him the task of finding Valade quietly. He found him, it seems, less quietly than we hoped." Moreau studied him. "So you sent one ghost to retrieve another?" "A harsh word, Inspector." "A true one." Delmas's smile faltered, but only slightly. "When men like Valade steal, they endanger more than reputation. Certain documents he took could not be allowed to resurface. We asked Béraud to ensure they did not. But apparently Valade carried remorse better than secrecy." "Did you tell Béraud to kill him?" Delmas blew smoke toward the blinds. "We told him to recover what was ours. The rest he chose." "And now?" "Now?" Delmas extinguished the cigarette, his eyes narrowing. "Now he is out of control. A crippled dog who believes he can still hunt. If he comes to me, I'll deny him. If he comes to you, you'll do what the law allows. Either way, this conversation never occurred." Moreau rose. "No, Monsieur Delmas, it occurred. You'll find that silence is a poor witness. It always remembers the wrong details." Outside, the air felt colder. He walked along the Parc Monceau fence, the iron bars glistening with condensation. Children played on the far path, their laughter cutting briefly through the gloom before fading into the city's hum. When he returned to the quay, a note awaited him on his desk. Janvier had written it in haste. "Madame Vautrin has disappeared. Neighbors say she left before dusk, carrying the red umbrella." He stood very still. The matchbox on his desk, the Belgian thread, the erased initials, all the small proofs of silence, seemed to realign around that single image. A woman stepping into rain she did not intend to escape. Moreau took his hat and left again, the corridors echoing beneath his steps. He walked fast through the dusk, following instinct more than reason, until he reached the Pont de la Tournelle. There, under the arching lamplight, stood the conductor from the Angoulême line, hat in hand, face pale. "I saw her," the man said. "The woman with the red umbrella. She met him, the one who limps." They stood there, no words, only the river between them. Then she dropped something into the water. "What was it?" "I couldn't see, but she looked lighter after it fell." Moreau's gaze followed the current. The Seine shimmered, indifferent as ever, swallowing yet another secret. Somewhere beneath that grey surface lay the letter never sent, the one that might have named who forgave whom. He turned back toward the city lights, his jaw set. The duel was no longer between two men. It had drawn in everyone who had mistaken silence for safety. And above the sound of water, faint and deliberate, came the distant echo of church bells, counting not the hour, but the consequences. Night did not fall over Paris so much as it settled, like an old coat with too many memories in its lining. The lamp-posts along the quays flickered into life, one by one, casting circles of trembling light onto pavement, slick with the residue of day-long rain. The city breathed in slow, deep rhythms, waiting. Somewhere in the spaces between that breath, Inspector Moreau walked with his hands in his coat pockets, tracing the last steps of a man who had never intended to exist. He followed the conductor's description through narrow streets where the gaslights showed everything and nothing at once. The arches of the Pont Marie shone ahead, pale and tired. Somewhere along its length stood the figure of Caporal Moreau, the one-legged soldier whose shadow had circled Valade like a debt no ledger could settle. It began with footsteps. Moreau heard them behind him before he saw the man, the uneven rhythm of someone who had taught his limp to lie. The inspector did not turn. He slowed his pace, allowed the city's silence to deepen between them. A corner, a stretch of balustrade opening onto moonlit water. Then a voice, flat and unhurried. "You went to Angoulême." Moreau turned. Moreau stood under the lamplight, one hand resting lightly on a cane, stained with the city's wet dust. His coat was too large, his hat brim low. The left shoe lifted with a scrape, then fell again. The rhythm familiar, yet no longer clumsy. Only earned. "And you left before the river could speak," Moreau answered. Moreau's smile was a cut without blood. "The river says only what's whispered into it. He had no right to whisper mine." "You followed him," Moreau said. "You hunted him. For what?" "For what was taken," the caporal replied. The words dropped like stones. Men like Valade think they can walk through life borrowing trust and shedding names, but there are mouths behind every name, widows, children, soldiers whose medals came wrapped in lies. "He stole documents," Moreau said. "Sold them. But what did he steal from you?" Moreau's jaw moved, a muscle flickering under his skin. "The war ended for some, not for me." He tapped his cane once against the stone. "We were in Arlon, near the old border. I carried dispatches, sealed with that same thread you found under your candle. One night, Valade disappeared with half the packet. The rest of it got me court-martialed, lost a leg, lost my command, lost the one woman who waited." His voice faded, then returned, thin as thread. "He wrote to her from Paris, said he was sorry, as if sorrow were a monthly wage." "The woman," Moreau said, and the name rose through the city's quiet, like something that had been waiting to be spoken. "Lys Vautrin." Moreau's eyes flicked upward. "You read his letter." "I read what he was afraid to finish," Moreau replied. The caporal moved closer to the balustrade, leaning against the cold stone. He came to pay his debt, but debts are not paid in letters, or in rivers, only in presents. I looked him in the eye. He did not beg, he never did. That made it worse. "Is that why you killed him?" Moreau's head bowed, but not in guilt. "I didn't kill him, Inspector. Not with my hands. The man you fished from the Seine, I raised him from the water myself." His eyes, hollow now, turned toward the river. "He stepped in, said it must be this way. I followed, but the current carried him farther than me." Moreau regarded him. "You expect me to believe that suicide preserved your conscience?" "I expect nothing," Moreau said, "except that you'll say I held the rope. And you'll be right." He looked up, his face drawn into a hard, tragic shape. "But I walked away. Can I ask the river to lie for me?" Behind them, a tram rattled on its tracks, the sound distant, softened by fog. A church bell began to toll, low and steady. Somewhere near the Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques, a red umbrella stood against the door of an empty room, drying slowly. Moreau spoke. She dropped something into the water. Béraud's eyes flickered. The letter I burned before he arrived, the one where he confessed. She saved what she could, always, even when it wasn't hers. She loved you both, Moreau said, not as question, not as judgment, only as recognition. Silence broadened. The wind rippled the surface of the river like a sheet of tarnished silver. Finally, the caporal stepped forward, cane tapping. "I can walk to the prefecture with you," he said. "But you and I both know it will change nothing. My war will continue. Yours will too." He began to move, one slow, deliberate step after another, toward the nearest street lamp that would lead him back toward the Quai des Orfèvres. Moreau watched him go. Each echoing step held neither regret nor victory, only wait. He did not follow immediately. Instead, he looked at the water, then at the bridge, then at the thin, wavering line where night and river merged. He thought of Lise, of the way she had folded her sorrow into silence. He thought of Valade, the man who had carried confession like unsteady luggage. He thought of Béraud, who walked now with the authority of a man who no longer feared consequence. Above him, the bells finished their count. Midnight had passed. Paris held on to its secrets for another day. Moreau turned at last and walked toward the lamplight. Somewhere up ahead, in the offices of men who practiced discretion like craft, he would write the first lines of a report that said everything and nothing. A report in which the river was only water, and 2 men had passed through it without leaving their names. But he knew, as the lamps shivered and the city exhaled, that the duel had never been between killer and victim. It had been between past and present, and silence had won. The sky over Paris the next morning was a pale, indifferent blue. A wind from the west tugged loose leaves across the boulevard and scolded the cafes into lighting their stoves earlier than they'd planned. Inspector Moreau walked the length of the Quai des Orfèvres with the slow precision of a man who knows the last part of a story carries more weight than its beginning. The pavement was still damp from the night rain, though the Seine itself reflected only calmness. That practiced calm of someone who has long ago learned how to swallow secrets. Inside the building, the corridors murmured with quiet industry. Files were carried, typewriters resumed their cadence, men who had slept poorly buttoned their jackets with an air of forced competence. Moreau entered his office, hung his hat, and sat without turning on the lamp. The light through the window was enough, grey and unadorned, like truth. On his desk lay 3 items, arranged as if waiting for a final sentence: the cigarette case, the matchbox, and the folded square of paper with the half-lettered name of Madame Vautrin. Beside them, an unsigned statement in Janvier's tidy handwriting confirmed what Béraud had chosen to say between cigarette drawers while being booked at the desk downstairs. "I did not kill him. I only took him to the river so he could finish his sentence without me." Delmas's report arrived shortly after, a masterpiece of official evasion. It claimed no knowledge of the affair beyond an unfortunate incident between private citizens. No mention of sealed packets, of wartime debts, of men whose names had been rubbed clean by years of careful exhale. The consulate made certain to absolve itself of all operational discrepancies while praising the efforts of the Paris police for their swift and appropriate response. Moreau set the report aside. It wasn't Delmas's voice that mattered now. It was the silence in the spaces where words would have named what everyone had already decided not to speak. Silence was the only witness immune to cross-examination. It made its own confessions. At 11, a knock. Janvier entered. He wants to know what happens next, meaning Caporal Béraud, meaning what becomes of a man whose war refuses to end just because peace declared itself. Moreau rose and walked with him to the interview room. Béraud sat on the chair, legs crossed at the ankle, cane propped against the wall. He watched them enter with mild curiosity, as one might watch clouds rearrange themselves and suspect rain. "You've seen the papers?" Moreau said, laying the morning edition on the table. On page 3, beneath advertisements for patent medicine and accordion lessons, unidentified body from the Seine. Foul play not proven. No photograph, just a silhouette. No name, not even a borrowed one. Béraud studied it. "That suits him," he said. "He never wanted to finish anything with his real face." "You'll be charged," Moreau said. "Not for murder. The prefecture won't argue what it doesn't want proven, but for obstruction, possibly complicit endangerment. A magistrate will ask if you assisted a man in harming himself." "I did," Béraud answered softly. "As much as a mirror assists a man in shaving." "You'll serve time," Janvier added. "Not long, perhaps, but time." "Time is what men like me have left in abundance." He paused. "Only, I won't tell them anything else, not even your name. You understand?" It wasn't accusation. It was the simple acknowledgement of two men who could not unlearn what they'd witnessed. Moreau nodded. The silence in the room was clean, the kind that did not bruise. Outside, as the door closed, Janvier spoke. "You think he told the truth?" "He told enough of it," Moreau said. "The rest is in the river." He walked back to his office. Before he sat, he took the matchbox in hand and turned it once, twice, as if considering some minor puzzle. Then he opened the drawer and placed it inside, along with the cigarette case, the folded paper, and his own small notebook, the one where he'd written his lone line from Angoulême. Two men, one seeking forgiveness, the other the shape of it. In the afternoon, he called on Madame Vautrin, not to accuse, not to warn, only to see. Her apartment was quiet, sun filtering through the thin curtains. The red umbrella stood by the door as before, now fully dry, now simply waiting. She poured him tea without asking why he'd come. He did not mention the river, or the man, or the charge. He spoke instead of weather, of old towns, of the sound cobblestones make after rain, things that allowed her room to breathe again. When he rose to leave, she stood with him. "Will he be forgotten?" she asked. "He lived without a past," Moreau replied. "But he won't rest without one." She nodded, not in sorrow but in acceptance, the kind that women learn from promises kept too late. Outside, the city pulsed with its late-day tempo. Bakers sweeping crumbs from doorways, students arguing beneath sycamores, musicians testing notes in the echoing arch of the bridge. Life insisted. The river held still. On his way back to the quay, Moreau paused at the Pont Neuf, where the story had begun. The wind was milder now, the water lay flat beneath a sky that was neither kind nor cruel. He leaned against the parapet, hands in his pockets, and watched the surface. The river didn't speak, but it didn't need to. Some confessions are meant to dissolve. Some truths belong to the currents that outlive them, and some duels, the silent ones, never aim to end in victory, only understanding. He stood there until the lamps flickered on, stretching their reflections downstream. Then he turned and walked back toward the quarter, where his own supper waited, ready to be eaten, ready to be forgotten. The case had found its shape. The names had failed to hold. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled again, counting not the hours past, but the weight of what remains unsaid. And with the sound of it fading into the great breathing hush of the city, Inspector Moreau let the silence claim what belonged to it,